welcome to the round 2 of the National Annual English Debating Tournament. My name is Janetha, and I will be your moderator for today. I'd like to begin by introducing our panel of judges. Mr. Jonathan Warner, headmaster of the British School of Ulaanbaatar. Ms. Ihuru, founder of Good Foundations Forming. Ms. Sura, English language lecturer at the Mongolian National University of Education. And Mrs. Sondra, who will be our timekeeper for today. Our motion is this House would tax every organization on their carbon emissions to combat climate change. On my left, representing proposition, is Sant School's third team. And in front of me, representing opposition team, is Sant School's team 6. I would like to remind everyone that during the first and the last minute of your speech, you are not allowed to offer points of information, and that each person should take at least 2 points of information during their speech. With that, the debate session is now in order. Let us hear from the first speaker of the proposition team. Please.
Good morning, honorable judges and fellow debaters. We're gathered here to debate on a very crucial topic that needs an immediate action. As the proposition team, we believe taxing every organization on their carbon emissions to combat climate change. Before debating, we must ask ourselves that, what is carbon tax? What is climate change? What causes climate change? And what is the purpose of carbon tax? Why is it important enough for us to discuss it? I, as the first speaker, will define the keywords that occur in carbon taxation and present the main points of our team to support our stand. Our second speaker, хүлээн, will continue to present our additional points and give further explanations and provide examples of how carbon taxation is administered around the world. Our third speaker, will be summarizing our points and rebut many of the points given by the opposition team. The reply speech will be given by our second speaker. Now, I will demonstrate why we support taxing organizations on their carbon emissions. Carbon tax is a fee that government imposes on any company that burns fossil fuels. The most widely discussed are coal, oil, gasoline, and natural gas. When these carbon-rich fuels are burned, they produce greenhouse gases. These gases, such as carbon dioxide, create global warming by heating the atmosphere. Our team defines climate change as a global phenomenon of climate transformation by the change in the usual climate of the planet that are especially caused by human activities, such as releasing carbon dioxide and the other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. The most vulnerable groups, including children, the elderly, people with pre-existing health conditions, and outdoor workers, people of color, and people with low income are at even higher risk because of the compounding factors from the climate change. Today, there is more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere than there ever has been in at least the past 2 million years. During the 20th and the 21st century, the level of carbon dioxide rose by 40%. We produce greenhouse gases in lots of different ways, such as burning fossil fuels, deforestation, and cement. Fossil fuels such as oil, gas, and coal contain carbon dioxide that has been locked away in the ground for thousands of years. When we take this out of land and burn them, we release the stored carbon dioxide into the air. Forests remove and store the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Cutting them down means that carbon dioxide builds up quicker since there are no trees to absorb it. Not only that, trees release the carbon they stored when we burn them. Producing cement is another contributor to climate change, causing 2% of our entire carbon dioxide emissions. As a result of climate change, the sustainability of the planet's ecosystem is under threat, as well as the future of humankind and the stability of the global economy. So what's the purpose of carbon tax? The purpose of carbon tax is to reflect the true cost of burning carbon. Those costs are borne by those who suffer from the effects, such as homeowners, farmers, and ultimately the government. Carbon taxes make sure companies and consumers pay for the external costs they impose on society. It's a Pigouvian tax since it returns the cost of global warming to their producers. We believe we should tax every organizations on their carbon emissions to combat climate change due to following reasons. I accept.
Who pays the carbon pricing?
The organizations that emit carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. The organizations who emit carbon dioxide. First of all, carbon taxes are clear and obvious. With carbon taxes, you can see how much aggregate revenue is being collected, and also you can see how those costs are being distributed across the different entities and that are paying those taxes. Secondly, carbon tax would provide the governments the necessary funds to invest in transfer renewable energy. I accept.
Isn't using carbon tax is approach from an economical aspect, not scientific?
Can you elaborate on
That is carbon tax an approach from the scientific aspect or economic aspect?
both?
Okay, thank you.
The tax reduces emissions in two ways. First, increasing the cost of carbon-based fuels will motivate companies and producers to switch to clean energy. This includes solar energy, wind energy, and hydro-powered sources. The carbon tax will increase the price of gasoline and electricity. Consumers will then become more energy efficient, further reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Under a carbon tax, the government sets a price that emitters must pay for each ton of the greenhouse gas they emit. Greenhouse gases are the negative externality. I accept.
Why not just let market forces lift fuel price?
Can you repeat your question?
Why not let market lift fuel prices, not the government? As you are saying, carbon taxes put it to government. Why not government, but just let market force carbon pricing?
Why not the government force the economy to carbon price?
Yeah. To carbon pricing. Why not markets do it instead of
The government instead of the government, because markets can propose carbon taxes to those who's paid. The governments can. They generate substantial costs that are borne by society at large, not just the person or organization responsible for the borne emissions. Thirdly, it would be a compensation for those who may see their energy bills and those who bear the brunt of flooding, fires, and disruption of supplies of food, water, and power caused by climate change. The good side of carbon taxes is that they are adjustable. It isn't clear how people would respond to a tax and how much it would reduce emissions. A carbon tax could be dynamically adjusted over time as the new information comes in. The cost could be raised if the emissions need to be reduced further, for example. It's harder to make those adjustments to other sort of policies. Our second speaker will give the further information on my second and third point, but she will also introduce a new point. It was economic growth by substantially increasing government revenue and by creating more job opportunities. Thank you.
8 minutes and 4 seconds.
Thank you for your speech, first proposition member. Now I'd like to invite opposition teams first speaker.
Good afternoon, honorable judges and fellow debaters.
Today, our team would like to light our views, opposing with the given topic that this House would tax every organization under carbon emissions to combat climate change. I am Hathim and I'm the first speaker of the opposition team. So today, the first thing we need to do is to redefine the topic as it had been biased by the proposition team. Carbon tax aims to restructure economies by raising the cost of critical resource, the thing that makes them run, but restructuring takes time as people, capital, and others do not flow seamlessly into new sectors. During the transition, resources can get unemployed for long periods. And the larger the immediate price increase, the larger the potential disruption happens. Our team strongly believes that carbon tax is not the right way to support combat climate change. And moreover, I will talk about the laundering of money from carbon taxes as a result of corrupt governments, and will also be talking about their evasion. Regarding our second speaker, Marat Nyambatar will talk about its regressive problem as the heaviest burden for climate change regulation costs falls on especially lower income groups. And as emissions need a policy package because the additional costs eventually depends on it and the markets aren't perfect, consumers aren't informed truly, and adjustment is not costless, political unsustainability will occur and there has to be a distribution.
POI.
I deny. Based on the economist Charles Colston, households in the lowest income group pay more than twice in the highest 10% of the income distribution paid. And her second point will be about slowing the economy, and last but not least, it's about its inadequate alternatives. And lastly, our third speaker, Qamar Lamar Bayer, will rebut the proposition team's points and do the conclusion. So, at the 2009 UN conference in Copenhagen, the Indian Prime Minister said that developing countries cannot and will not compromise on development, and that they have long opposed carbon taxes on the grounds that they are bad for economic growth. Stating that carbon taxes will raise business costs, hurt profits, and diminish the competitiveness of exports, they have long refused to consider climate change agreements without important transfers from industrialized countries. For example, companies in remote locations such as Bermuda, the Cayman Islands, or certain places in Switzerland are another form of tax avoidance. Another example is that the employment of tax lawyers, consultants, and a multi-billion-dollar industry whose primary purpose is the minimization of the tax burdens. And it's a carbon leakage that happens when the regulation of emissions in one country pushes emission to other places with less restriction.
POI.
Yes, I accept.
Even though other alternatives may have less time adjusting, aren't carbon taxes better in the long term?
So, I'll talk more about that on my second point. So, although there is a cap and trade program that helps to prevent carbon leakage, only 9 states in the US participate in the program, and its trouble is that it only applies to power plants when it's not expected to adopt a carbon tax anytime soon, as the nations struggle to set a price on carbon to make a dent in reduction. Governments have to consider the risk of losing businesses or causing outcry due to rising energy costs. Moreover, developed countries leak emission to developing countries. And the most significant greenhouse gas emitters such as China, India, Brazil, Indonesia are also the countries with the highest levels of tax evasion. They use carbon tax as a motivating example, using the tax evasion effect to reduce the cost of controlling emissions. I deny. And a model suggests that the impact of considering tax evasion is significant, as in China, 98 89% in China, and by 97% in India. Therefore, favoring all this clearly shows that wherever carbon tax goes, evasion will always follow it and that it would never stop. So moving on to my second point, which is laundering a carbon tax. To explain it simply, fraud has high returns over a short period of time, so it makes it difficult to prove, meaning convictions are sparse. So to answer your point, carbon tax has a multiple downsides, as the governments will launder the money. So
POI?
yes.
Why are many countries implementing carbon taxes if they're so inefficient?
My second speaker will talk about the effort in her speech. So, and in Germany, 6 people scam 200 million euros in tax in the European carbon market. And according to RFI France News, 1.6 billion euros were swindled by 12 people in the huge market scam. And one protagonist told the French news that I worked hard running my scams, but with the CO2, it wasn't a problem at all, meaning that stolen carbon tax money is a piece of cake. So ultimately, and the cases that occurred and the data that have been produced prove that the carbon tax is very much flawed and that it is unchallenging to fraud. Needless to say, to see one country reduce emissions only to see another increase theirs as a result is not a solution to combat climate change. Thank you.
6 minutes and 47 seconds. Thank you for your speech, opposition team first speaker. Now I'd like to invite the proposition team's second speaker. Whenever you're
Barack Obama once said, "We're the first generation to feel the impact of climate change and the last generation that can do something about it." Good afternoon to our honorable adjudicators, our opposing team. I'm Hola number 7, the second speaker of the proposition team. I stand here to elaborate on the points our first speaker introduced in her speech and other additional information. According to the World Meteorological Organization, without measures to reduce greenhouse gases, global temperatures are projected to rise about 4 Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And by the end of the century, temperatures are already increased by 1 Celsius, and with rising and irreversible risks of collapsing ice sheets, disruption of ocean circulatory systems, inundation of low-lying island states, and extreme weather events. Longer, more intense droughts threaten crops, wildlife, and freshwater supplies. From polar bears in the Arctic to marine turtles off the coast of Africa, our planet's diversity of life is at risk from the changing climate. Climate change poses a fundamental threat to the places, species, and people's livelihoods. And while the world has been plunged into a deadly pandemic, scientists are sounding the alarm once more that climate change is still the greatest threat to human health in recorded history. Everyone must treat climate change with the same urgency as they have COVID-19 by reducing carbon pollution and preparing for the consequences of global warming, which we are already experiencing. This is why our team believes that we should tax every organization on their carbon emissions to reduce and combat climate change. First of all, we admit that taxes are unpopular and are often considered an anathema for politicians, but they actually reduce uncertainties for companies. It gives them something they can plan to, and if they don't have a tax, they're going to be hit with policies that are less predictable, potentially more onerous, and more inefficient. Taxes allow industry to become more efficient and use cleaner technologies, and is spurring new and innovative approaches for cutting pollution, using energy differently, and saving money. That is a better alternative to free market economies than government regulation. For that reason, even oil companies support the tax. ExxonMobil, Shell, and BP have all called for the tax. Exxon even donated $1 million to the nonprofit that supports its preferred plan. BP's chief executive has promised to cut emissions. A carbon tax also boosts economic growth. For example, Sweden's carbon tax has reduced its emissions by 26% in the past 27 years. During that same period, its economy grew 78%. A properly designed carbon policy will be good for the economy. Carbon fee and dividend legislation will have a positive impact on our well-being, especially if we consider the avoided cost of climate change and the health benefits from reduced air pollution. As far back as 2009, 98% of economists said a price on carbon would promote efficiency and innovation, and 10 years later, support for a carbon fee and dividend was declared by 46% of world's economists. A 2020 analysis of carbon pricing in the European Union found that it increased both gross domestic product and job growth. I accept.
How will carbon taxes handle plastics or petrochemicals?
Plastics and petrochemicals can be implemented in other taxes, other form of taxes, but carbon tax is at least doing something that controls fossil fuels. Back to my speech. When our opposing team claims a price on carbon will depress the economy, they fail to consider how recycling money back to households changes the results, and also fail to account for the huge costs of doing nothing. Carbon tax revenue could also fund productive investments to help achieve the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, including reducing hunger, poverty, inequality, and pollution as an effect, and the government environmental degradation. For example, in the provinces where the federal price on carbon pollution is effect, the government of Canada uses approximately 90% of fuel charge proceeds to directly support families through climate action incentive payments delivered through annual tax returns. These payments moved to quarterly payments in 2022. Let's imagine a supermarket where the price of a certain product goes up by $5, but the shop is giving out $5 bills. You can still buy that product and use that rebate to cover the additional expense, or you can pocket the extra money and buy something less expensive. It's the same case with carbon tax rebates. A higher price, but a chance to pocket extra cash if consumers find a cheaper way to get around. Through these, the majority of Canadian families receive more money. I accept.
Do you think it's fair to use carbon taxes revenues to fund other taxes or like to do other projects?
I believe that we as a team believe that using the revenue to support these low-income families and households are the most efficient way to boost the economy and boost their lives, as they're the ones that are suffering the most. By making choices that reduce their emissions, Canadians can avoid paying the price on pollution while still collecting the full climate action incentive payment. The remaining fuel charge proceeds are returned through other federal programming. Not all groups are affected by carbon pricing the same way. The government recognizes that particular groups or sectors may require targeted support or relief, in particular because of the small number of alternative options they may have in the face of carbon pricing. Under the federal system, relief is provided for farmers, fishers, residents of rural and small communities, users of aviation fuel in the territories, greenhouse operators, and power plants that generate electricity for remote communities. Carbon taxes can play a key role in achieving countries' pledges under the 2015 Paris Agreement, which lays the foundation for international action to combat global warming. These commitments must be updated every 5 years, and they're generally straightforward to administer because they can be piggybacked on existing fuel taxes, which most countries already collect with ease. In fact, the fiscal and administrative case for carbon taxes may be especially appealing in developing economies where larger I accept.
Is there any drastic change on global temperatures with the help of carbon taxes?
With the help of carbon taxes, we've seen examples from British Columbia, Canada, and Australia that it's reduced the general temperature. With the establishment of emission monitoring capacity, variants of carbon taxes can be applied to other sources of greenhouse gases, such as emissions from forestry, international transportation, cement manufacturing, and mining and drilling activities. If we allow ourselves to see examples where carbon taxes are used in the world, we will realize that this policy is working for the countries exceptionally. The World Bank reports that 40 countries and 20 municipalities use either carbon taxes or carbon emissions trading. That covers 13% of annual global greenhouse gas emissions. Our third speaker will elaborate on the examples around the world where carbon taxing has worked exceptionally, and thank you for your time.
Thank you for your speech, second speaker of the opposition team. Now I'd like to invite the opposition team's second speaker.
Good afternoon, honorable judges and fellow debaters. My name is Matan Nyambatan. I'm the second speaker of the opposition team. Our first speaker has already introduced the idea of tax evasions and carbon leakage. Today, I'll be stating 4 main points. My first point is that if a carbon tax is put in place, it's gonna be regressive. So a regressive tax is a tax applied uniformly, taking a larger percentage of income from low-income households than from high-income households. While it may be fair in some instances to tax everyone at the same rate, it is seen as unjust in other cases such as carbon tax. Carbon tax is disproportionately becoming burdensome to people of low income. A recent study examines the consumer tax burden from a hypothetical European Union-wide carbon tax. They find that the distributional effect at the European Union level is regressive, driven by the high carbon intensity of energy consumption in relatively low-income countries in Eastern Europe. Conversely, in high-income countries where transport fuel is a necessity, carbon taxation is slightly regressive. Carbon pricing makes poorer people who still suffer a welfare loss when prices rise, making their consumption basket more expensive. Letting market prices of fossil fuels rise immediately to reflect social costs are not desirable.
QI.
Accepted.
Will carbon taxes still be regressive if we fund the revenue to the low-income households?
Yes, because carbon tax is a flat taxation which requires to be regressive. The additional costs from higher prices would consume a greater share of income for low-income households than for higher-income households. Because low-income households generally spend a larger percentage of their income on emission-intensive goods. Another issue with carbon taxes is that they target carbon dioxide emitted only from fossil fuels. They do not directly target other carbon compounds, which has a short atmospheric lifetime but a large warming potential. Alternative, non-tax-based policies are needed and used to limit carbon and other greenhouse gas emissions from these sources. These include altering manure and waste management, feeding or land use practices, among others. Okay, my third point is that a carbon emission tax will slow the economy. Carbon tax burdens on these 3 groups: low-income households, workers, and investors in emission-intensive industries, and people in regions of the country that rely on emission-intensive industries for their livelihood or that use the most emission-intensive fuels to produce power. Accepted.
How will carbon taxation depress the economy even though we're preventing the cost of other health problems in the long term?
It's gonna hurt more for poor people.
How will carbon taxation depress the economy even though we're preventing the cost of other health problems in the long term?
Carbon taxes will hurt poor people more in today's situation. So, the higher prices it costs would reduce the purchasing power of people's earnings, effectively reducing their real wages. Lower real wages would have the net effect of reducing the amount that people work, thus decreasing the overall supply of work. Investment would also decline, further reducing the economy's total output, explaining increasing prices of fossil fuels can increase the cost of producing physical capital. Therefore, it will lead to a reduction of profits on investment. It means the amount of investment will reduce and outputs are going to be lower. Similarly, workers and investors in emission-intensive industries who would see the largest decrease in demand for their products would be likely to bear relatively large burdens as the economy adjusted to the tax. Finally, areas of the country where electricity is produced from coal The most emission-intensive fossil fuel per unit of energy generated would tend to experience larger increases in electricity prices than other areas would. Denied. Moving on to our last point. There is a societal view on carbon tax, or also known as carbon pricing. The government will face problems framing and solution orientation. Carbon pricing frames climate change as a market failure rather than as a fundamental system problem. Therefore, people may take carbon emission as political taxation and one kind of a threat from the government. Thus, climate change is not the biggest problem that citizens are facing compared to inflation and poverty. Okay, there are countries that have introduced taxes on carbon in the 1990s, including Norway. According to data from the World Bank, carbon dioxide emissions actually increased in Norway between 1990 and 2015, although it had a carbon tax. By comparison, Belgium dropped its emissions during the same period in a pattern that was similar to Finland's, but they didn't have a carbon tax. If carbon tax was really useful, why would carbon dioxide emission in Belgium in Norway will rise? We argued that climate change can be more appropriately understood as a system problem. Over many decades, these systems have become increasingly locked into the combustion of fossil fuels and the associated release of greenhouse gas emission. Consider, for instance, how the design of cities have developed alongside the diffusion of the gasoline-powered personal automobile. How norms about and the tire have become entwined with energy-intensive indoor temperature regulation, and how important political and economic interests have become entrenched with fossil fuel-based resource development or electricity provision. Thank you for your time and attention.
6 minutes 58 seconds.
Thank you for your remarks, opposition team's second speaker. I'd like to invite the opposition team's third speaker. Whenever you're ready.
All right. Good afternoon to our honorable judges and to our opposing team. My name is Batter, and I am the first speaker of the proposition team. Today, we are living in a truly unprecedented time. A global climate crisis is at large. Every time we turn on the TV, we hear about how every year is the hottest year on record, how every year the polar glaciers are melting at increasingly high rate, and forest fires and hurricanes are becoming ever stronger. It is also an economic and humanitarian crisis as well. Climate change could force more than 120 million more people into poverty and could cut the world economy by $23 trillion in 2050. If unprecedented changes are not made soon, there will be irreversible damage to the planet. The climate crisis is worsening inequality, as those who are economically vulnerable are devastated by climate-fueled crises, such as hurricanes, floods, and fires. Therefore, we, the proposition team, support the motion for taxing organizations based on their carbon emissions, which will reduce CO2 emissions in two primary ways. There is nothing extreme with this idea. Economists across the political spectrum have supported that more than 40 governments around the world have done it already. First, we can funnel the revenues generated by carbon tax into our goal of completely moving away from fossil fuels. There will be greater possibilities of things we can achieve by investing in wind turbines, solar power, hydropower, and perhaps in nuclear power. We can also use the revenue to aid developing nations, as well as it has been decided at the COP27 meeting. While addressing climate change by reducing greenhouse gases, carbon taxes can also generate more immediate environmental and health benefits, particularly by reducing deaths that result from local air pollution. I accept.
Okay. Do you believe that other resources can completely replace fossil fuels?
Yes, we have many alternatives, such as we have mentioned. However, that takes time. That takes funding, and we can generate the funding from carbon taxes. All right. In Mongolia, where we struggle with air pollution as our most prominent problem year after year, imagine this situation getting worse than it already is. Since right now, Ulaanbaatar is one of the most polluted capital cities in the world, and at its height, daily air pollution reached more than 27 times the level World Health Organization recommends it as safe. They can also raise significant revenue for governments, the revenue they can use to counteract economic harm that may be caused by higher fuel prices. For example, governments could use carbon tax revenue to ease the burden on workers by lowering personal income and payroll taxes. The opposition team claims that the carbon tax would hurt the economy. In fact, the opposite is true. Investing in renewable energy could create millions of families-staying jobs and build the infrastructure we need for marginalized communities to access clean water and air. In other words, we can turn this climate crisis into a climate opportunity. They have also expressed their concerns about tax evasion. We can overcome this challenge by increasing government oversight and transparency, as well as appointing qualified officials, both internal and international. Countries that oppose carbon tax generally rely or get lobbied by fossil fuel industries. Also, we have stated that we can direct a certain percentage of carbon tax revenues to compensate for increased energy costs and can help that ensure that the tax doesn't disproportionately affect the poor.
Doesn't Mongolia has our 11 big renewable energy sources, and why doesn't they influence onto air pollution?
Because the amount of renewable energy sector in Mongolia is not enough. And we have to say that again, like we need funding to create sufficient enough renewable energy sector to cut out carbon industries. All right. Second, we have said that the climate crisis is worsening inequality. Rising temperatures are exacerbating this pre-existing disparities in access to clean water and affordable food. Finally, other policies such as net zero policy or cap and trading policies are less effective than carbon taxes. For example, incentives for renewable power generation do not promote from switching coal to gas or from these fuels to nuclear, do not reduce electricity demand, and not least do not promote reductions beyond power generation. And we know that carbon tax has been recommended by the world's top economists. In conclusion, the opposition team claims that the carbon tax to climate change would harm the economy, disproportionately affect the poor, and would be not good. However, in reality, their opposition to carbon tax hurts the very same group of people they are talking about and would not be affect the economy in a negative way. This reminds us once again how reliant on fossil fuels and other carbon emitting industries we have become. This is why we have to use the revenue generated by this tax and use it to fund our transformation to renewable energies, and fossil fuels would be depleted eventually anyway. On top of that, we don't have the luxury of time right now The poles are melting faster and faster, record fires and hurricanes every year, and more disasters would only increase if we do not take action now. Can we put our planet over profit? Can we successfully combat climate change? Yes, we can, and yes, we will.
Thank you for your speech, Proposition Team's third speaker. Now I'd like to invite the Opposition Team's third speaker. Please go ahead.
Okay. Good morning to the honorable judges and fellow debaters. Our topic of the debate is this House will tax every organization on their carbon emissions to combat climate change. We, the opposition side, has already presented our points and how we firmly oppose the given topic. Now, the term climate change has been uttered for a long span of time, and it is indeed a huge risky failure following the Industrial Revolution, and it must be resolved, if not reduced, immediately. But this doesn't advocate for immediately jumping into solutions, such as risking the economy and, as mentioned by our proposition's first speaker, taxing every bit of carbon dioxide within the atmosphere. Now, carbon tax would fall heavily on workers and investors in carbon-intensive industries, as well as on regions that depend heavily on carbon-intensive fuels, particularly coals. And closest to us, of course, Mongolia, we are more familiar with. The energy sector in Mongolia's largest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. Mongolia's resources and organizations heavily depend on fossil fuels. And if we tax them, of course, following this heavy burden will fall on the citizens and the workers and employees, therefore unemployment. And Mongolia's most fossil fuel is produced by also households, not organizations. Therefore, again, stating that this will fall on the citizens.
POI.
I accept.
How can other alternatives support the renewable energy production later on?
With productions, projects such as carpentry, and it has been stated by some speaker, and carpentry is already been implemented by countries which produce the most carbon emissions, and in 9 states, and also America does not have carbon taxes, but they went for something such as carpentry. Moving on, and further going to developed countries, some countries which produce the most CO2s into the atmosphere is still debating whether or not they should have a carbon tax or not, as stated America. It is applicable for highly developed countries, but even some of the countries that are developed enough face many issues regarding carbon taxes. Canada, which has implemented and increased their carbon tax, further resulted in increasing their use of fossil fuels by 3%. Now, as stated by the second and the first speaker of the proposition team, most economists suggest that carbon tax is a good aim towards assisting and reducing climate change acceleration, and that higher the tax, the better. They accept.
What if cap and trade permits are given to those who have personal connections to politicians?
There is no resource that says that carpentry projects are from people with connections with politicians. Also going further into my points, according to Nature Journal, they made a statement which points out how we need a pretty high price per ton of carbon, upwards about 100 euros per ton, in order to really galvanize and change the signals for a significant switch towards low carbon energy and green resources. With larger taxes, burdens fall on citizens. With large taxes and higher variable costs might reduce business profits. The product price will definitely increase, and further increasing utility bills, reduced exports and slower economy, and so on. Now, when asked the second speaker of the proposition team whether or not carbon tax will have impact on global scale, they replied with countries, not on global scale. And now we will clear up our questions as answer to our question and rebut their point. Now, let's imagine a situation where every country in the world have come up together to act on all of their carbon reduction plans. The best case scenario on the impact on global temperatures by the end of the century is 0.17 degrees Celsius. And now what we're trying to do with carbon taxes is reduce it by 2 degrees, not low as this. Now, if we take carbon tax into action, even increasing them wouldn't have an impact on a global scale. Overall, does this statement on carbon taxes does not necessarily encourage people to take consideration towards climate change, does it? By using tax as a way to make people come to the realization that our planet is likely to become more and more dangerous, as if we are presenting climate change as something similar to a threat. Climate change must be viewed as a problem we'd like to solve. We get encouraged to solve, not get forced to solve.
Yeah.
Third speaker of I would like to ask all of you a question. Should we let our future be dictated by foreign control, unreliable government, and quite frankly, uninspiring taxes? Tax on anything has to go through several changes before even reaching the desired outcome or effect. In other words, it is difficult to know external cost accurately. And now, to sustain our nature, the environment, and for the future generations to tax every organization on their carbon emissions to combat climate change is not the solution. It won't have further impact globally, however, it will impact other aspects. Now we will sum up our statements with a quote by climate activist Greta Thunberg. The fact that we are still having this discussion, and even more that we are subsidizing fossil fuels, directly or indirectly, using taxpayer money is a disgrace. End quote. Thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you for your speech, opposition team's third speaker. Now, at this time, the first or the second speaker from each team will deliver a 4-minute reply speech. And I'd like to remind everyone that point of information during reply speeches are not allowed. Now, let us hear from the opposition team first.
So now has come to a time to wrap up this debate and the clashes of this debate. And we have seen today from proposition world believes that organizations that emit carbon dioxide only gets taxed when the people with the lower income gets affected the most. But you have heard today that the opposition side has more realistic approach. The approach that realizes combating climate change by instituting a carbon tax actually is not going to work towards the goal. So on this debate, today there has been two primary questions. Firstly, does a carbon tax affect carbon emissions? We have heard from the proposition team that no one likes to pay that much of money, so we'll turn to alternatives. But we have shown you through this debate that there will be evasion, and they would go to places with fewer restrictions to pollute more than they do, only to perpetuate the global warming. And also the opposition team stated if we raise the prices of the economies, there will be no strength left to bring a way of combating climate change. And secondly, whether or not this plan helps global warming, the proposition world believes that a carbon tax will lead the world into something much more. But opposition world say that in fact the majority of the countries will not ever follow, as their economy will suffer. And therefore, adding to a global warming because of carbon tax leakage and evasion by polluting more than ever and contributing to global climate change. What we have seen today as a team is our opposition world proposed a central way on the topic, whilst the proposition team proposed that they they heavily proposed on the revenue of carbon taxation. Realistically speaking, we have seen today that the proposition is a theme that advocates a destruction of our society to pursue something that does not even work. On the other hand, a team opposition is being reasonable and convincing you to stop before making another reckless step. And therefore, the proposition team failed to consider the great sacrifices the carbon tax is making on its way, just like they don't care about the hardcores the low-income groups are going through. Thank you.
And thank you. 2 minutes 54 seconds. Thank you for the opposition team's reply speech. Now let us hear from the proposition.
Hello again to our honorable adjudicators and members of the opposition team. I stand here to conclude today's debate and introduce some main clashes that went on today. The opposition side has tried to explain why carbon taxation should not be implemented, but they have not provided us with sufficient reasons why they believe other alternatives are better. In contrast, this House provided substantial evidence as to why carbon taxation has been effective in countries that have already imposed it. With the exhaustion of fossil fuel resources looming on the horizon, it is crucial that we develop a coherent strategy to transition away from carbon-based energy sources. We make the case that government should utilize a carbon tax to mobilize new technology markets in an effort to respond to the developing energy crisis. Major clean technologies like solar, wind, biofuel. The government must support these emerging industries if they're able to play a central role in the creation of new, wealth-generating, environmentally responsible economies. A carbon tax, more so than other alternatives like cap-and-trade programs, presents the best alignment of technology, capital, and policy to directly respond to the approaching energy and environmental crisis. And we believe we've won this debate because we've demonstrated the benefits and many types of advantages that carbon taxes have over other alternatives. No one wants to pay more taxes, but the reality is that the tax can be implemented and result in no extra tax revenue being raised. It just shifts where taxes are being pulled from and encourages the shift to low carbon energy that will save us so much in the long run. In Mongolia, where we struggle with air pollution as our most prominent problem year after year, imagine the situation getting worse with the effects of climate change. The world and our country must do something quickly, or else we could still live with the mentality of high infant mortality rates and people dying of respiratory diseases as the new normal. Climate change is real, and we're already dealing with the effects. Why don't we stand up for ourselves this time and take action? I would like to thank the judges and our opposing team for their participation and valuable contributions. As we conclude this debate, we'd like to restate our belief. This House would tax every organization on their carbon emissions to combat climate change. Thank you for your time and attention.
2 minutes 38 seconds.
First of all, thank you for participating in this wonderful debating tournament, and all of you were very good and brilliant, and it was very difficult to chat also. And anyway, I got scores, and I gave the opposition team 300 score and the opposition team 295 score. Okay, it's just for my score, and others have other judges. And also, I have little comments and feedback, and if less reading would be more great, right? And I think that's all. Thank you.
If I can jump in, folks. I think that's the first proper debate I've seen all day. genuine, strong points of information taken and offered by both sides. Speeches which referenced and refuted points that were made by previous speakers. That was a pleasure. I really enjoyed listening to all of you. I really thought that was excellent. So very well done. I really am impressed. I do agree with the points. Get away from your notes a little bit more, guys. You don't need them. You're good enough speakers to actually put them down and talk to people. A couple of points on a piece of paper, 3, aid memoir, you can do it. That I'd say is your next step forward. And I'd say that to all of you. But really, really good. Let me see now. I mean, some lovely, lovely stuff. Watch your timings, 1 or 2. You're just a little bit too short there. You do want to make sure you get right into the end. Your final minute, it's important because it can harm scores and points. But the arguments and the structures were very good. I would also just, again, this has been quite nitpicky in some respects, but look at the fact that make sure your points of information are directly pertinent to what is being said. 1 or 2 weren't. I must say, Proposition 2, young lady, killer POIs. Good, very, very good. You knocked a few out of the park there, and I was really impressed with yours. But good all of you. But I particularly think yours stood out as being pertinent and at the right time. Very good. No, that was a real pleasure. Honestly, relatively hard to score, but I think there is a clear winner for me. A proposition team, I rated you 311, and opposition team 277. So for me, proposition has it, but that was terrific. Very high standard. Thank you.
Right, my turn. Thank you so much, all. Very happy to judge.
Yeah.
Okay. So number 1, proposition team. You had really good you did really good background stuff. It sounded like master research. But I would be happy if you focus more on the argument, strong argument, and come up with it. And you really did by explaining it well. And then second, opposition team, you had a really good, strong argument points, and you were straightforward. But I want you to be more often, because you denied all of the questions, right? And you were a little bit nervous, but that's fine. It happens, yeah. And then number 2 is you should be more. I think you really did good on really good points, but you can be more engaging. That would be really. I think you guys had this strategy. This team had focused more on the background research, and they did back up with the points. But you guys straight to the point. This, and then like that. And then and I think everyone shouldn't be looking at their papers that much. Yeah. And okay, I think that's it. Yeah. Oh, and then my score is proposition team 302, and your team 302.
To both teams for the amazing presentations, and congratulations to the opposition team for